Do we want to shut those doors? Or? Okay. We're going to call this meeting to order. And it's an honor. This will be the first committee hearing on the Asia Pacific Subcommittee. And it's an honor to be the chairman. And I welcome you guys here and thank you for being part of this committee and allowing me to be at the helm of it. Good afternoon and welcome to the first meeting of the Subcommittee on Asia and the Pacific of the 115th Congress. The subcommittee will come to order. Members present will be permitted to submit written statements to be included in the official hearing. Without objections, the hearing record will remain open for 5 calendar days to allow statements, questions, extraneous material for the record, subject to length limitations in the rules. The People's Republic of China's aggressive and provocative behavior in the maritime territorial disputes represents a threat to vital U.S. interests as severe as those from Russia, Iran, North Korea, and terrorism from the Middle East. According to the Heritage Foundation's 2017 Index for U.S. Military Strength, since 2013, China has rapidly advanced its maritime capabilities, employed them to transform the South China Sea with artificial islands, place Japan under increasing pressure in the East China Sea, and attempt to restrict freedoms of navigation in its near waters. Unbelievably, China has suffered little, if any, cost for this maritime push. In the South China Sea, China has built over 3,200 acres of land over disputed features in the Spratly Islands, complete with military-capable airstrips, ports, radars, anti-aircraft weapons, and confirmed just last week surface-to-air missile silos. China also continues to press the Japanese vessels around the Senkaku Islands in the East China Sea. Uncommitted to existing global norms, China continually undermines attempts at a unified response to these activities from the ASEAN and has attempted to use its economic influence to buy off other claimants. The United States and our allies and partners recognize that our military presence in the Western Pacific has been a force for stability and for good across decades. But so far, we haven't acted with nearly the level of resolve that China has in its aggressive pursuit of its arbitrary claims. For example, officials from the last administration proclaimed the importance of freedom of the navigation far and wide in response to China's effort to restrict it. But this fundamental right and the international law which protects it was only hesitantly enforced with 4 freedom of navigation operations, none of which challenged China's tacit assertions that its artificial islands are entitled to territorial seas. For nearly a decade, we have said much and done little. While the South and East China Seas may seem distant, we have important national interests at stake. The disputed areas are key global economic and trade arteries. Nearly 30% of the world's maritime trade moves through the area. Domination of these routes might allow a regional power to use disruption as leverage. The security of these areas is also essential for the energy security of key U.S. defense allies and partners. Most of the energy supplies of South Korea, Japan, and Taiwan come through the South China Sea. Energy insecurity among our friends in the region could have serious implications for our ability to handle potential contingencies arising from North Korea and elsewhere. Perhaps most importantly, the lack of U.S. resolve hasn't just allowed China to change the status quo on the ground, but contributes to worries among our allies and partners that the United States lacks sufficient commitment to the region and feeds the narrative that China has been successful in degrading U.S. influences and global norms. The perceived potency of our military and diplomatic power is very much at risk. The South and East China Seas are strategic keys to East Asia, and acquiescence to restrictions on U.S. forces' freedom of operations there will undermine the U.S. security guaranteed and degrade both regional and world stability. We need a new strategy, and the entrance of a new administration represents a good opportunity to form and implement better policies to represent or reassert U.S. strengths in these critical areas. It may be time to consider an assertive plan. As we have seen endlessly, backing away from conflicts carries its own risk. China has taken advantage of U.S. acquiescence to revise the status quo, advancing its strategic interests in ways that raises the risks of conflict. Timidity hasn't de-escalated these maritime disputes. It has only raised the stakes. Today we'll hear from suggestions from our expert panel for defining U.S. goals and addressing China's maritime push, as well as policy options to operationalize more effective U.S. engagement on this important issue. And at this moment, without objections, the witness written statement will be entered into the hearing record, and I now turn to our ranking member, Mr. Sherman, for any remarks he may have.
Chairman Yoho, thanks for those remarks. Welcome to your new role. I look forward to working with you, and you will find, as you already know, that I am hawkish on our trade relationship with China and dovish on the so-called islands, more reefs than anything else. China is waging every day an attack on American working families by refusing to accept our exports and by demanding co-production agreements when they will take a few of our exports, demanding that we transfer factories and technology as a price for having some limited access to their markets. That is devastating state after state in America, and instead we're focused on these islets. Why? Well, because the most powerful economic decision makers in America is Wall Street, and they want us to ignore the devastation of America's working families. And the most important decision maker in the area of our military and national security is the Pentagon and others who want to see a 10% increase in our defense budget. And they know that China is the only worthy adversary to the might of the American military. So I do think it's important that we look at our bilateral relations with China, and the aggression of China in the South China Sea, the China Sea, is an irritant. And maritime disputes and our support for a free international maritime regime is important. If it was more important, we might join UNCLOS and actually be part of the international order when it comes to maritime disputes. Instead, we focus all of our attention on China's refusal to adhere to international law on these disputes. There are 20 maritime disputes that do not involve China, and not a single one of them has been the subject or even a partial subject of any hearing of this subcommittee, any subcommittee, or the full committee of Foreign Affairs. Why? Because none of those disputes justify a massive increase in the American military budget, and none of those disputes distract us sufficiently from the war that China is waging against American working families. Now, we're told that these islands pose this great threat to international trade because $5 trillion of trade goes close to these islets or reefs. Yes, almost all that trade is going in and out of Chinese ports, and if China controlled these reefs, they could blockade their own ports, and what threat, witnesses, does that pose to American national security? Now, some of that trade are oil tankers coming from Saudi Arabia to Japan, and in a worst-case scenario, and I do not add, where China somehow dominated wrongfully and tried to interdict in this area, those tankers would have to change their course, thus increasing the cost of gasoline in Japan by at least 1/10 of 1 cent per gallon. That's the worst that could happen to international trade. As if they could blockade their own ports, they could force some trade to go a little on a slightly different route, and that's a level of aggression that I don't think any of us would tolerate. So let me see. Finally, we've got to look at burden sharing. Japan demands that we risk lives to defend these uninhabited islets, and that we spend billions and apparently need to shut down a third of our State Department to be able to afford to do it, to defend these islets. They spend less than 1% of their GDP on defense. We have to defend their islets. There's no oil there, but if there is any oil there, it's Japan's oil or South Korea's oil. It's not our oil. But also, What happened to our mutual defense treaty when America was attacked on 9/11? Our European partners at least put troops in harm's way. Some of them are spending 2% of their GDP on defense. Japan said, well, we've got this constitution, so we won't help you, and we won't amend our constitution either to help you. So Americans died by the thousands, a country with a mutual defense treaty with the United States, binding them to help defend us, basically ignored. I think there was a ship in the Indian Ocean that had a Japanese flag on it. So we are told that the Pentagon needs more money to defend islands that Japan is unwilling to tax itself to defend, a country that responded rather insufficiently when America was attacked. And we are told, don't pay attention to China's attack on American working families. Pay only attention to whether they're adding a little dirt to a reef in the South China Sea. I yield back.
I appreciate my colleagues' comments there, and yes, there are a lot of other conflicts or areas that are concern out there. But when we start seeing military equipment going in there, land strips and things like that, I think it causes more concern in this issue, and I look forward to the dialogue. And at this point, I'd like to yield a minute to my colleague, Mr. Rohrabacher from California.
And congratulations, Mr. Chairman,
Thank you.
on being Mr. Chairman. Let's just note that President Abe in Japan has been doing his best to end the type of relationship that you have just described. President Abe and the people of Japan are honorable people, and they are courageous people when they have to defend their interests. We have been doing that, and we've insisted upon that all since the end of the Second World War. President Abe is moving forward now and trying to move through his parliament an end to the restrictions that were placed on Japan by their constitution after the Second World War. I think that and we should applaud that. I don't know if, certainly the last administration did not applaud it, and I would hope that President Trump would indeed look at what Abe's trying to do to become an equal partner rather than a junior partner who's being taken care of. So we should applaud that. And second of all, in terms of what's going on with the Chinese, if we turn our back and just say that doesn't affect us, what we're talking about is an arrogant disruption of international right-of-ways, both in the air and on the sea, that will do nothing but embolden this rotten dictatorship in Beijing from moving forward with even more aggressive moves elsewhere.
Thank you. Now we'll turn to Mr. Barra, Dr. Barra from California.
Thank you. And I want to add my congratulations, Chairman Yoho, and welcome back to the ranking member. I think this is a timely topic for us to start this session of Congress off and this subcommittee off. I was in Japan last week, had a chance to meet with the Prime Minister, with Prime Minister Abe and some of his team. And I think it's very important for us to reassure our allies in the region that we will uphold our commitments. I mean, we can talk about the South China Sea, we could talk about the East China Sea. More acutely, what's happening in North Korea is an existential threat to Japan and our allies in the Republic of Korea. So this is very much a timely topic. And I would agree with my colleague from California, Mr. Rohrabacher, that Prime Minister Abe is trying to step up some of Japan's defensive capabilities and working within the confines of their constitution to take on some more of the burden. But again, with a bipartisan group meeting with our Japanese counterparts, we did send a strong message that we're ready to stand with our allies in the region in a collaborative way. So thanks. I'll yield back.
Thank you, and I appreciate your comments. And the thing I'm excited about is so much trade goes through here, and this region is so important to so many people around the world that it's having these discussions in the open that we can help maybe draft policies that would direct our State Department, our administration, and build alliances stronger in that area and focus on economies, trade, and national security that affects all of us. And so I look forward to those debates. As typical for meetings, we'll have 5 minutes of questioning. You'll each have an opening statement of 5 minutes that'll be submitted into the record. And then each member will go back and forth for 5 minutes of questioning. And so with that, I would like to introduce our panel. Mr. Dean Chang, Senior Research Fellow at the Heritage Foundation's Asia Studies Center. Thank you. You've been here before, and we appreciate you coming back. Dr. Michael Oslin, Resident Scholar and Director of Japan Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. And again, we thank you for your contributions. And Dr. Michael Swain, Senior Fellow at with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, Asia's program. And I've read all of your opening statements and several things from you, Dr. Swain, and I look forward to a informative hearing. So with that, Mr. Chang, if you'd start your opening statements. Thank you.
Chairman Yoho.
And make sure everybody turns your mic on when you speak.
Yes. Chairman Yoho, Ranking Member Sherman, members of the committee, thank you very much for the opportunity to testify before you this afternoon at the first meeting of the Asia and Pacific Subcommittee. My name is Dean Cheng. I'm the Senior Research Fellow for Chinese Political and Security Affairs at the Heritage Foundation, but my comments today reflect solely my own opinion and do not reflect the views necessarily of the Heritage Foundation. As has been very clear to anyone who's been watching the news, China is heavily engaged in the South China Sea region, as the PRC has been asserting claims over an extensive expanse of the South China Sea based on a combination of claims of historic rights and a so-called 9-dash line that was laid down in 1947 under the previous government of the Republic of China. The Permanent Court of Arbitration at The Hague, however, found that neither of those arguments was in fact a basis for legitimating China's very expansive claims, including its artificial island construction in the Spratlys. It is worth, I think, considering a bit about why China is so interested in the South China Sea. And I would suggest that there are several factors involved that are driving China's insistence on pushing in the region, even when it antagonizes its neighbors. And these broadly fall into the categories of resources, strategic depth, and national reputation, as well as the potential capacity for the Chinese concept of deterrence, which it is important to note, for the Chinese incorporates the idea of coercion. If you have read Bernard Brodie, Thomas Schelling, Herman Kahn, the American concept of deterrence is solely focused on dissuasion, but for the Chinese it incorporates coercion. When we talk about resources in the South China Sea, we tend to assume that it's about oil. The funny thing is that although there have been a number of studies about potential hydrocarbon reserves in the South China Sea, the actual amount of hydrocarbons discovered by various test wells has in fact been extremely limited. It hasn't yet panned out. The main resource currently that is actually of particular interest to the Chinese, but also to neighboring states, is that of food. The South China Sea includes some of the richest fishing grounds in the world, and while some of those fishing grounds are actually now being pushed towards collapse due to overfishing, it nonetheless remains a key source of relatively free protein. And as China moves up the socioeconomic scale, its people are demanding more protein. So if you're going to try and meet those demands, you can import meat, which is going to be very expensive, or you can try to catch more of it basically off the hook, so to speak. The second aspect here is strategic depth. And here, the Chinese have a distinct need to control the East Asian littoral, not just the South China Sea, but the waters up through the entire First Island chain as a defensive measure, because China's center of gravity, its economic center of gravity, is now on the coast. If you think about Shenzhen, Shanghai, Pudong, Tianjin, these are all port cities. And this is where China has invested billions and billions of dollars over the last 30 years in terms of building up its economic infrastructure. The South China Sea, however, is especially important given the militarization of Hainan Island, which contains, among other things, China's newest and largest spaceport, a facility for ballistic missile submarines, a carrier berth, submarine pens, and multiple military airfields, including the one that the U.S. EP-3 had to crash land on after the collision in 2001. One of the American trump cards is our submarines, our nuclear attack submarines. They're extremely quiet. China has openly discussed the creation of sonar surveillance arrays in the bottom of the South China Sea. Those arrays need to come up at some point in order to collect the data, to allow the data to be analyzed and exploited. And I would suggest that some of these islands may serve that particular function. In addition, for the Chinese Communist Party, legitimacy rests upon core interests. And among the core interests that were defined by the senior counselor Dai Bingguo in his meetings with then Secretary of State Clinton is maintaining territorial integrity and state sovereignty, which is especially important in the wake of the so-called century of humiliation that China suffered when China was faced with the potential of dismemberment. So the South China Sea, like Taiwan, like Xinjiang, like Tibet, is increasingly associated by the Chinese leadership as basically, if we lose this, where will it end? Where will it stop? It is no surprise then that the U.S. has been accused of fomenting the entire South China Sea problem by such senior leaders as General Feng Fenghui in his joint press conference with then Chairman of the Joint Chiefs Dempsey and Madame Fu Ying of the National People's Congress. So within this broad context, then, China is driven by a number of considerations here to push for extending its sovereignty over what normally would be considered international common spaces. And this is likely to become even more urgent as China's leadership faces the 19th Party Congress this fall, where Xi Jinping is going to wind up with an entirely new leadership cadre. In order to counter China, I think some of the things that we should be considering, and which I hope the committee will consider in future hearings, are the issues of maintaining a presence in the region, emphasizing the legality of the Permanent Court of Arbitration findings, and employing economic as well as more traditional political and diplomatic means to pressure China. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and I appreciate your testimony. And that's things that we want to gain out of this. And, you know, we'll come back to some of your comments that I have questions. Dr. Oslin, if you would go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Sherman, members of the committee, I'm honored to speak to you today, before you today, on the issue of U.S. maritime strategy in Asia. With a new administration, it's a particularly timely moment to do so. I believe it is also time to adopt a larger geostrategic picture of the entire Asia-Pacific region, seeing the South China Sea, the East China Sea, and the Yellow Sea as one integrated strategic space, or what we might refer to as the Asiatic Mediterranean. The United States maintains several enduring interests in maritime East Asia. First, since the close of World War II, we have sought to prevent the emergence of a hostile hegemon that could dominate our partners or eventually threaten the U.S. mainland. U.S. forward-based military forces along Asia's First Island chain have served to deter full-scale war in Asia for more than 6 decades. Second, the U.S. maintains an interest in preserving our network of allies and partners in the region. American alliances remain a fundamental source of our strength in the world. Third, the U.S. retains an interest in defending the free flow of trade and commerce through Asia's waterways. Annually, $5.3 trillion of trade passes through the South China Sea. U.S. trade accounts for $1.2 trillion of this total. There are numerous threats to U.S. interests or potential threats to U.S. interests that may emerge in the future. From a domestic political perspective, Beijing views its maritime claims in the South and East China Seas as what it calls, quote, blue national soil, unquote. Foreign claims to the Spratly and Paracel Islands are an infringement, in Beijing's view, on its sovereign territory, and Chinese leaders have hardened their public positions on the South China Sea over time. China's 9-dash line encompasses 90% of the South China Sea. While Beijing remains vague about its claims to the waters and airspace within the line, it considers the area to be historically Chinese waters. To both defend its maritime claims and protect its southeastern flank, Beijing has spent the past 3 decades building its military power projection capabilities out to this First Island chain and beyond, developing anti-access area denial technology and naval forces to challenge the U.S. military in its near seas. Over the past 2 decades, Chinese ships have harassed, shadowed, and interfered with the activities of U.S. naval assets operating in its near seas. While in the East China Sea, the PRC continues to challenge Japan's administration of the Senkakus by frequently sailing flotillas of fishing boats, Coast Guard ships, and maritime militias in and around the Senkaku territorial waters. By slowly changing the situation on the ground or on the water, China hopes to transform the Asiatic Mediterranean into a Chinese lake. Chinese control of the South China Sea at the exclusion of the U.S. is obviously not a fait accompli, but we must act to implement a counter-coercion strategy if we hope to maintain assured access to Asia's littorals. Let me mention a few policy recommendations. First, we should demonstrate diplomatic leadership. Washington's network of allies and partners throughout the Asia-Pacific remains the backbone of our engagement in the region. The first order of business for the Trump administration is to continue energetic diplomacy throughout the region to assure allied capitals and signal to the Chinese that we remain committed. Later this year, I hope to see the administration send high-level attendees to the June Shangri-La Dialogue, the August ASEAN Regional Forum, and the November East Asia and APEC summits. Diplomatic jaw alone, however, is insufficient. We must also strengthen economic ties with our liberal allies in the region. While the current administration has declared the Trans-Pacific Partnership dead, it has remained open to the possibility of bilateral free trade agreements. If it pursues this path, then the best place for President Trump to start would be with Japan. In addition, we must engage in more multilateral security cooperation. It is incumbent on the U.S. to attempt to better train and equip the forces of Southeast Asian nations, as well as our allies and partners, to resist coercion and intimidation by the Chinese Navy and raise the costs of Beijing's salami-slicing strategy in East Asia's seas. I believe the U.S. must continue to raise foreign military financing levels in Southeast Asia. In 2015, Congress authorized a $28 million East Asia-Pacific Foreign Military Financing Fund that could be dispersed to various Southeast Asian nations as needed. This pot of money should be renewed annually. The U.S. should also encourage regional players to engage in these cooperative security efforts, including our allies Japan, Australia, and South Korea. And finally, we should reinforce these efforts with U.S. hard power. We should increase the tempo of our freedom of navigation operations in the region, not as a provocation, but as a signal that we will defend our rights in accordance with international law. We must be more willing to use coercive diplomacy to raise the costs on China and against its actions against our allies or our interests. The goal, in conclusion, is not to back the Chinese into a corner or goad them into further aggression, but rather just the opposite. They must understand that unprovoked and belligerent acts will merit a rejoinder. Otherwise, they will get the wrong message and continue testing the U.S. government and our allies. Thank you.
Thank you for your statement. And Dr. Swain, I look forward to hearing yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, members. It's a pleasure to be here today. Let me speak first about the situation in the maritime areas as I see it. Since roughly 2007-8, China has clearly taken a more assertive and active stance toward its long-standing territorial claims in the South and East China Seas, both bordering its long maritime coast. In truth, the historical dynamic at work in the disputed maritime areas has long involved an interactive tit-for-tat rivalry among the claimants, made possible by the absence of any clear and commonly accepted code of conduct and driven by deep-seated suspicions and strongly felt nationalist impulses on all sides. In recent years, however, Beijing has certainly gone beyond such proportional tit-for-tat interaction to apparent attempts to establish itself as the dominant claimant in the Spratly Islands, which is the southern islands in the South China Sea, arguably to deter perceived provocations by others and to establish a strong position in future negotiations, correcting what had been a very weak position in that area. In the case of the East China Sea dispute with Japan, Beijing has also departed from its past tit-for-tat stance in an attempt to establish itself in recent years as an equal claimant to Tokyo over disputed islands, thereby supposedly correcting years of what it regards as Japanese dominance. While not taking any formal position in support of any claimant's sovereignty, Washington has clearly focused the vast majority of its concern and its actions since roughly 2010 on Beijing while backing its allies. The obvious danger presented by this situation is that increasing numbers of U.S., Allied, and Chinese air and naval assets operating in close proximity to one another, or perceived provocations of various sorts, including further military deployments onto land features, could produce escalating crises and conflict. This danger is reinforced by the failure of China, and to a lesser extent other disputants, to clarify their specific claims regarding various waters. Contrary to widespread claims in the media and elsewhere, Beijing has yet to define exactly what the so-called South China Sea 9- line denotes regarding the waters within it. The resulting uncertainties stimulate worst casing about motives and behavior, thus leading to further escalation. So what's to be done in this situation? First, I think there needs to be a recognition that a continuous unilateral U.S. military escalation in presence and activities in an effort to attain a clear-cut level of military predominance over China will have at best a limited short-term dampening effect on the worsening security competition and would more likely make the situation much worse. The forces of nationalism, the public visibility of actions taken, the close proximity of the disputed areas to mainland China, and Beijing's continued economic and military growth and distrust of the U.S. make a confrontation more, not less likely under such circumstances. Moreover, barring an unlikely near-total collapse of the Chinese economy and/or a major surge in the overall U.S. GDP, Washington will not possess the capacity to greatly exceed the kind of military and economic capabilities that China will be able to bring to bear in its nearby maritime areas over the coming years. We are looking at the emergence of a de facto, unstable balance of power in the Western Pacific under present conditions. Second, in place of an open-ended escalation, a stable, enduring modus vivendi among all relevant parties is needed. This should center on agreements to exercise mutual restraint in asserting local sovereign or special rights, as well as an effective, peaceful process for handling incidents. Such an understanding ideally should consist of several elements. The first is a far greater emphasis on diplomacy than we've seen thus far, to establish an interim set of understandings among the claimants and between Beijing and Washington regarding levels and types of militarization and non-use of force. The United States and China must take the lead in this effort, based on a common recognition of the need to remove the maritime issue as a driver of their deepening strategic competition. A second element should include a staged diplomatic process for clarifying the jurisdictional disputes involving both sovereignty issues and non-sovereignty rights over resource extraction, such as fishing. Washington must do more to facilitate this effort and not leave it simply to Beijing and the other disputants to determine. During this process, Beijing would need to clarify the meaning of the 9- line, and all claimants would specify their claim to land or underwater features in corresponding waters, as well as so-called historical rights, ideally as they relate to relevant legal definitions under UNCLOS. Third, on the basis of such clarification of claims and jurisdictions, all parties in the South China Sea and East China Sea disputes must reach an agreement on those areas subject to joint research development and a procedure for implementing such development. Finally, on the basis of the previous actions, the claimants must eventually negotiate elements of a binding code of conduct for limiting levels of militarization and handling future incidents over the long term. Obviously, many obstacles would confront any efforts to greatly reduce disputes over maritime territorial claims, and American leverage is extremely limited in this area because of its failure to ratify UNCLOS. How can Washington seriously press China and others to abide by UNCLOS rulings and establish a code of conduct when it refuses to subject itself to such scrutiny? These obstacles are not insurmountable, however, especially if they are placed within a larger effort to create an overall regional balance of power, and they must be surmounted since the likely alternative is a steady escalation toward more crises. Thank you.
Thank you, and I appreciate everybody's comments, and that's what we're here for is, let's define the region. Let's define what the norms are. And Dr. Oslin, you were talking about China pressing its national sovereignty in the out islands against international norms and our historical agreements with countries like Japan, the Philippines, Taiwan, South Korea. If we look at the advent of those and when they came out, it was peaceful in nature, non-aggressive, non-encroaching on other nations, whereas what we're seeing with the government of China has expanded its reach. We see the militarization of the islands that have come out of nowhere, the castles in the sand, and I think your description of the Lake of China versus the South and East China Sea is very descriptive in the mentality coming from the Chinese government. And when we see not just offensive weapons on there, but the defensive, but the offensive weapons, I think it's time that we come to the table and get clarification on this so that we can make policies and get people in agreement on that. And after becoming party chairman in late 2012, President Xi announced that his so-called Chinese dream, which he said would lead to the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nations. How important do you think China's maritime claims in the South and East China Seas are to achieving President Xi's Chinese dream? That's question number one. And what are Beijing's ultimate goal in the South and East China Seas, and how far do you believe China is willing to go to defend these claims? And I'm going to open it up to all three of you, but Dr. Oslin, if you'd start on that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think that in terms of the ultimate goal that Xi Jinping has, it is, which is not surprising for any national leader, it is to have the ability to do what he decides he wants to do in the future, meaning to reduce any restrictions on either his own capabilities, which is a domestic issue, or against those such as the United States who may pose an obstacle, or potentially international norms that conflict with those interests. One thing I don't think we have fully appreciated here in the States is the degree to which China considers the new territories that it has built and reclaimed in the South China Sea as sovereign territory, and how that will change Chinese doctrine, military doctrine, defense doctrine, should they feel that those territories are at risk. After all, they point out to us that there are post offices and schools on those islands, not just airstrips and defensive installations. I think, secondly, to wind up in terms of your question as to how important this is, it is, I would not say it is the single most important driver of China's perception of its own position and role in the region, but it is part of a much larger perception that China has of regaining a position of dominance that it once had, of being recognized as, if not the hegemon, as the dominant player, and therefore with the ability to have its own perceptions of what its interests are and the norms that surround those respected by its neighbors. This is where the other nations in Asia push back. It is where the United States has hesitated to step in to uphold the global norms that go on to issues that include free trade and fair trade. So that's where I would actually link Ranking Member Sherman's opening statement with our discussion on security. It is a question of liberal norms and behavior globally. Thank you.
All right, let me interject in here. Dr. Swain, you were saying, as you stated, it'll be harder in the future for us to have more of a presence there. You know, if you look at our economic situation and our military strength, that's why I find it's imperative that we have an agreement now and an understanding that we can build from in the future. What are your thoughts on the direction that we should go in knowing our current state of affairs in America?
Oh, that's an important caveat.
We'll just deal with the Asia-Pacific area right now.
Yeah. I mean, in some respects, I think we're moving in the wrong direction on a lot of fronts. I'm not a big fan of the revoking of TPP. I think it can be modified, and it's something that signifies American presence in the area. But I do believe that it is incumbent on the United States to think long-term on this issue and think hard about what are relative capabilities in that field, in that area, because they are changing. And the ability of the United States to be able to predominate in the Western Pacific is going to go away. And so how do you deal with that effectively? Well, you can argue that you want to double down and just spend more on defense and you'll maintain that gap. I don't think that's going to be feasible, particularly if the United States is not a strong economic player in the region as well. So the best thing the best procedure is to move towards some type of balance of power in the region. And that means gaining understandings with, first of all, allies, the United States, with Japan, with South Korea, and with the Philippines, about what is needed in the region in the long term. And secondly, reassuring them that balance of power does not mean accommodation. Balance of power does not mean retreat from the region. Balance of power does not mean a weak U.S. The U.S. acts on the basis of its strength and influence to try and do that. And I've laid out a whole series of moves that I think are necessary in a report that I wrote last year on this question.
I saw that, and I appreciate that, because that's what this is all about. You know, we can't do it. It's non-sustainable for us to do it alone. We have to come to agreements in that area so that we can forge those strong alliances and have a common understanding, because if we allow the precedents of China moving on, what does that allow any other nation to do the same thing?
Right.
And that's what I fear. We need to come together on an agreement. I'm out of time, and I'm going to turn this over to the ranking member for his 5 minutes.
Thank you. I want to make it clear, I regard this aggressiveness by China as important. I'm just not so sure it's as important as the administration has said, as ISIS or Crimea. American weakness is hurting us, and American weakness is demonstrated by our weakness on trade. And our response is, well, let's get tough on the islets. Yes, China may be stealing some fish from Japan, but China's refusal to accept American imports, China's demand for co-production agreements, where we have to transfer technology as a price for access to their markets. This has devastated whole Michigan and Wisconsin, Ohio and Western Pennsylvania, millions of American families, and we show weakness every day that we do not impose tariffs on Chinese goods coming into our country. And the best way to preserve our weakness is say, look over here, there's some islets, there's some fish. What we haven't discussed much here is how China and its government can use nationalism to retain power. It works here, it works there. Now, the Chinese government has a problem in that there's no theoretical answer for the question, why does that government rule? Democracy is a good theoretical basis. Theocracy works reasonably well for the government in Tehran. And even the divine right of kings has justified why people are in control. But the rulers in Beijing are not the vanguard of the proletariat. Their only answer for the question is why they rule is exaggerated nationalism. And we play right into that hand. We may have to, because they may get so aggressive that we have to respond. But we play right into their hands when we confront them in the South China Sea. Dr. Oslin, you talk about coercive diplomacy. Got anything in mind other than yelling loud? Give me, spend 10 seconds and just tell me what is one example of coercive diplomacy.
Including disinviting China from maritime exercises that we can invite them to, like RIMPAC, curtailing military exchanges, considering whether or not to continue high-level diplomatic dialogue.
Some of that just makes the South China Sea far more dangerous. They play games, we respond, and I don't want to start a war there by accident. I notice coercive, you didn't say tariffs as part of that. You say that $1.2 trillion of U.S. trade passes through the South China Sea. Can you name the #1 port that trade goes to that isn't Chinese? Does any significant portion of that $1.2 trillion not U.S. trade with China?
All the leading ports are Chinese.
All the leading ports are Chinese. So once again, these strategic islands would allow China to close off trade with the United States through Chinese ports. Dr. Swain, Japan has this constitutional provision. Does that prevent them from spending 1.5% of their GDP or even 2% of their GDP on defense? Does that prevent them from defending what they say is their own territory?
Well, they have by law, they have restrictions on the amount that they pay as a percentage of their GDP.
That's by law. That's not their constitution. We have a law that we spend only so much for defense, and we're going to change that law every year. What?
They could spend more.
They could spend more.
They could spend
and
more.
They could, but they choose not to because they would rather we defend them.
Well, it's if I may, it's a little bit more complicated than that.
I'm sure it is, and if I was given more than 5 minutes, we'd explore all those complications. And again, we respect the Japanese people, but their willingness to tax themselves to defend what they claim is their sovereign territory faces certain political limits. And we're told that we've got to increase our defense budget by 10%, and that these islets are an important part of that. And 9/11 happened 16 years ago. Has there been any effort in Japan to say we have to amend our constitution so that we can send forces to Afghanistan? Can you, Dr. Oslin, name the leading Japanese politician who has called for the deployment of Japanese troops to Afghanistan?
Combat troops, none, but they sent reconstruction troops to Afghanistan, and they had an 8-year refueling mission in the
Okay,
Indian
but they haven't put their people in harm's way.
They are precluded by the Constitution.
And
currently from
not a
doing that.
single Japanese politician has stood up and said, America has defended us for the better part of a century. America was attacked on 9/11. It's time for us to change our Constitution for the purpose of helping America. No Japanese politician has said that.
Congressman, they respond to their constituents as you do.
Exactly, and their constituents want my constituents to pay for the defense of their islets, and their constituents don't want to pay in blood or treasure for the defense of America, which is happening in Afghanistan right now. Again, these islets are important. We shouldn't let China walk all over us. But the other view, I'm glad to have represented here, and I think we have a balanced hearing because I'm sure that there will be others who will present the other side. I yield back.
Well, thank you, and I would yield to myself as long as the chairman's out. Look at that! I got it in my hands finally.
Oh, wait a minute! You've got one on your
That's right.
controlling the whole world.
That's it. There you go. I have some very strong agreements with Mr. Sherman on some of the trade issues that he has brought up today, and I also have some very strong disagreements with him as to the scope and depth of how we approach China today, a threatening China to the world peace. Certainly, China, I led the floor fight when I first came here with Chris Cox against most favored nation status with China. At that time, we made the argument that those people who were telling us that the more affluent and the more trade, the more affluent China with more trade with the United States meant a liberalization of China. We would eventually have a more democratic government. That has proven to be absolutely wrong. And that I call it the hug a Nazi and make a liberal theory, and it is no more liberal and politically than it was 2 decades and 3 decades ago. In fact, there's some evidence that at that time, because of Tiananmen Square, they actually had more freedom than they have today in terms of political freedom in China. So let us note that the idea that we have permitted a monstrously oppressive regime that brutalizes their own people, that we have enabled them to put the rules of trade together that has resulted in a massive transfer of wealth that has then been kept in the control of the clique that runs China. And as you said, Mr. Sherman, this is not a clique that is now directed by beliefs of some philosophy like they are the proletariat as they were during the communist days. No, this is just a self-serving, vicious, fascistic clique that runs China, and that threatens the world when that type of clique becomes a massive military power and dominates a region of the world. That's when it becomes a threat beyond trade, and that is what's happening today. That massive wealth is being used to build up their military capabilities, and what we have seen is an arrogance of decision-making in Beijing, which is, and I would say, again, there's no opposition parties there. There are no people. There's no reason for them to worry about public opinion. This is just a power play by arrogant oppressors, as we have seen in many throughout history. You have a vicious dictatorship in a country that becomes a military power. They always end up aggressing upon their neighbors. So with that, that means we have a threat to deal with, especially when all the signs are there, which in the South China Sea is not a, if I just note here, the South China Sea is closer, these Spratly Islands and these other islands here, maybe not the Paracels, but yeah, even the Pericles Islands, are closer to the other countries in the South China Sea, meaning the Philippines and even Indonesia and certainly Vietnam, much closer to those countries than they are to China. There was no island there before. We're talking about reefs that were underwater at high water. Now, I was lucky after the CIA for decades prevented me, I say for a decade, not decades, for a decade prevented me from flying over the Spratly Islands. And about 15 years ago, I managed to fly, get another plane from anywhere where I got it, to fly me over the Spratly Islands. And there they were building the islands. And so all of this time, for the last 15 years, we know that they have been building those islands. And we have let it happen. We have not confronted it, which they have seen as a sign of weakness. What maybe we could have done, if maybe start building islands of our own. We could have maybe financed the Filipinos to go there and build their own islands right next door. See what they would have thought about that. But most importantly, when we're trying to come to this formula, and I only got a couple minutes for you to reply, but let me just note, I think the most important thing in making sure that we have peace and stability in that part of the world is not to ignore everything but the trade with China, but make sure that we work with the Japanese. The Japanese are the only ones who are strong enough to counterbalance this. And let me note that if the United States has had a country foolish enough for decades to say, let us take care of all of your defense, the American people wouldn't be in favor of using their money when the other country would let them cover their defense. It's time for us not to cover the defense of Japan, but treat the Japanese as equal partners and allies and help President Abe, who is committed to being a force to counteract this, what I consider to be evil coming out of Beijing. Now, I have overspoken my time, but I will give all you witnesses 15 seconds to say you're out of your mind or I really like what you had to say. So, Mr. Chang.
You may not like their answer.
I would note, sir, that what is essential is a comprehensive approach towards dealing with China. We cannot succeed in dealing with China simply via trade or simply via military or simply via diplomatic issues. Comprehensive includes what you have noted, which is working with our allies, but it also means thinking about all of the instruments available to the United States, including access to our markets, as Representative Sherman has suggested, including financial markets, as well as things like supply chains and things like that, where if much of that trade is going to China, that's not finished products necessarily, but it's often key spare parts.
Very good.
Representative, just very briefly, I think we do start with our allies and our partners. Japan spends $50 billion on its military per year. It is purchasing advanced weaponry such as the F-35, and it does take the lead in protecting its own islands in the Senkakus. The United States Navy has done none of that. What they ask for is a guarantee that should war break out with China, that we would honor our alliance commitment to them. But the Japanese Coast Guard and Navy are always the first responders constantly to China.
You're out of your mind. No.
Great.
I mean, I just fundamentally disagree with many of your assumptions,
Okay.
Congressman. I mean, I think looking at the Chinese system as simply a question of communist dictators bent on overtaking the world is a very inaccurate way of understanding them. Mm-hmm. Yes, it's a one-party dictatorship. Yes, they restrict a lot of political freedoms within their regime. They are not, however, ruling over a population that is dying to overthrow them. They have a lot of people in China who are very supportive of what the PRC regime has done over the last 30 to 40 years, and I'm sure you're aware of that. It's raised their standards of living up very high. No, they don't have political rights in a variety of ways that we would like them to have, but they are not going to become like an American liberal democracy. They're going to have some version of some kind of stronger state because of the size of the country and because of the history of the country and the fear that they've had of instability and collapse within that regime. Now, you can argue that a democratic China would be much better for us and much better for them, but give me a good sense about how you get there without creating chaos, and I'd be very willing to hear, because nobody's thought of how to do this. So what you have then is an effort on the part of the Chinese government to expand their growth to as great as they can, and they do it for the people as well as for themselves, and to establish a military that is going to reduce what they regard as their vulnerabilities. The United States has dominated the Western Pacific right up to China's 12-mile limit for the last 70 years. That is changing. The question is, how do you address that problem without provoking a conflict with the Chinese? They're not like Iraq, they're not like Grenada, they're not like Panama. They have nuclear weapons and a big military.
All right, thank you, and we do have fundamental disagreements, but neither one of us are out of our mind. Sometimes we'll have a good discussion on that. Thank you. And Mr. Becerra.
Mr. Becerra is back in California.
Barra. No, we just met with him this afternoon.
You know, I think this is a very important and interesting dialogue. I'd agree with you, Dr. Oslin, that, you know, as we look at Asia and the Pacific, and certainly East Asia, in the latter half of the 20th century, post-World War II, post the Korean conflict, the U.S. presence really did have a remarkable effect in creating a stable democracy in Japan, creating a stable democracy in the Republic of Korea, you know, helping create thriving economies, and, you know, that was a good thing. And, you know, I do think it is important for us to reassure our allies in the region that we are not withdrawing from the region. You know, I think it is also a good thing, you know, as, you know, Prime Minister Abe and the Japanese government looks at stepping up some of its own defensive capabilities, understanding some of the threats. You know, and one of those threats clearly are tensions in the South China Sea. And I'd agree with my colleague, Mr. Rohrabacher, that, you know, we should have responded sooner, but we are where we are. And, you know, part of the challenge of not responding sooner is, you know, there is you know, if you look at some of the Chinese strategy is, you know, they'll provoke, see what kind of response that they get. If they don't get a response, well, then they'll push a little bit further and see what kind of response. And, you know, at this juncture, it becomes a much more complicated issue, much more so in the South China Sea than in the East China Sea. None of us has an interest in creating a kinetic conflict. And there's always a danger, you know, of an accidental kinetic conflict, which, you know, whether that's, you know, a Chinese vessel with a Japanese vessel or a Filipino vessel or an American vessel. And that's the danger. So we do have to think about strategies to start reducing those tensions. I do think, you know, the other big piece of it, whether you supported TPP or were opposed to TPP, these are the fastest growing markets in the world. There clearly is a benefit to American companies to be able to compete and sell in these markets. You know, we sell a lot of American products in Japan. We sell a lot of American products in Korea. And as the other Southeast Asian markets and Chinese markets open up, we want to be able to compete and sell our products there. That is good for American workers. We want to make sure we do it in a fair way. If I start to think about the next steps, and maybe I'll give each of you a chance to talk about that, with this desire to avoid a kinetic conflict, that wouldn't be in China's interest either. How do, you know, what would be one or two next steps to start reducing those tensions and using some of our soft power to reduce and de-escalate the region? Maybe Mr. Cheng, if you want to start.
Thank you very much, Representative. Several thoughts do come to mind. First, I think it is very important to note that the Chinese leadership does have to worry about public opinion. They are not subject to election, of course, but when we watch how quickly they suppress and limit the internet and the free flow of information, it is very clear that is something that worries them. And that is something that we should continue to champion at a political level, internet freedom, at a governance level in terms of not walking away from things like ICANN, and at a technical level in terms of promoting the ability to flow information around, over, and through the Great Firewall of China. The other thing here is to consider the extent to which China's activities in places like the South China Sea land reclamation are nonetheless dependent on Chinese companies, which in turn are dependent upon imports. The spare parts required for the mechanical act of reclamation often is sourced not in China, ironically enough, but in Europe or the United States. And a diplomatic effort on the part of the U.S. to bring in Japan and our allies to basically constrain Chinese behavior or else suffer the consequences to their supply chains is, I think, one that is worth considering.
Dr. Oslin.
Congressman, I think you're right that we are where we are, meaning we are in a different situation today than we were 8 years ago or 16 years ago. There are certain things we cannot do today. There are other things that we can. I would say first, we do need to consider how to best build the capacity of our partners, high-end partners such as Japan, as well as lower-end partners, those that are struggling to just protect their own waterways. Second, I think enhancing the U.S. presence, ensuring that we maintain a robust U.S. presence, which is both air and ground and naval in the region, that there is co-training, there is exercises, there are port visits and the like, is not inherently predominance, but it does maintain stability, and it sends messages of reassurance. At best, what I think we want, not at best, but what I think we want to do is complicate China's perception of what it is able to do uncontested in these areas and nudge it towards a more cooperative posture. And I think you do that by creating a community of interests.
Great. Dr. Swain.
Well, I mean, there's several different aspects to what needs to be done. One of them is domestic. The United States needs to, as I said before, think very carefully about what the long-range future of the United States is in the Western Pacific in terms of its capabilities, its influence. How likely is it able to match specific types of resources with specific types of objectives? And I don't think that dialogue or that discussion has occurred. Nobody thinks really long-term about U.S. capabilities and tries to understand a range of outcomes that may occur and what you would do to try and minimize the less likely or the less favorable ones and maximize the more favorable ones. That's the first thing. The second thing I think we have to do is we have to have a discussion with our allies about them improving their relations in various ways with the Chinese. There's very little discussion by the United States in interacting with China and ASEAN to do with their disputes in the South China Sea. After all, the disputes are about them. It's about their relationships. And we need to be more effective diplomatically and not be reducing the State Department, cutting back on the State Department capability in order to engage with allies and with others in the region on how they're going to develop a real code of conduct. The Chinese have committed themselves to this. They're supposed to have a framework for a code of conduct by the middle of this year. The United States barely says a thing about it. It needs to base itself on the 2002 declaration that ASEAN and China reached, and then use that as the basis for moving forward for a code of conduct that will cover a lot of these areas.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to forward Mr. Sherman 30 seconds.
One comment is that we might be stronger diplomatically if we were part of UNCLOS. We don't subscribe to the international standards for maritime disputes, but we demand China do so. But I want to pick up on what Mr. Cheng said. They do need to manipulate their domestic public opinion. They will especially need to do that if economic conditions change and they can no longer develop, provide 5 or 10% economic growth. And if there's a recession in China, the best or the most likely way for them to try to retain power is to go eyeball to eyeball with us and wrap themselves in nationalism. I yield back.
Thank you. At this time, we'll go to Mr. Perry from Pennsylvania.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I know this goes back a ways. It's probably longer than most people care to think about, and maybe it's not even relevant to today's conversation. But I always think for historical purposes, it's important that we remind ourselves in a way how we got here. And I'm one of the people that believes that a United States diplomat named John Service and the fall of Chiang Kai-shek as opposed to Mao and our State Department and our meddling on the behalf of communists have helped create the problem that we now find ourselves within. And I just think it's important to think about those things because I see parallels to today with some other places we're engaged in other things we're doing. That having been said, I'd like to turn to Mr. Cheng. Our new Secretary of State, Tillerson, warned of a more confrontational South China Sea policy, but also said that the island building had to stop and that access to those islands would not be allowed. The President has recognized the one China policy, as we all know. The last administration expressed a floor for China, including the militarization of the South China Sea. But as far as I can tell, that was never backed up, never backed up in the last with any action. So the question is, so if we're going to maintain that there is a floor for China, what specific conditions should we articulate to China regarding that? And when China invariably breaks the floor or floors, what should our actions be?
Congressman, I think that to begin with, we should be treating our allies and our friends at least as well as we treat China. So I think that the incorporation of China into things like RIMPAC, when forces from, for example, the Republic of China, Taiwan, are excluded, sends, I think, a very distinct message to Beijing, especially when they show up not only with the forces that are supposed to show up, but also spy ships, which were uninvited. And yet we are apparently going to invite them yet again. They showed up in 2014 with a spy ship as well as their forces. They showed up in 2016. And now apparently we're going to invite them again in 2018. That isn't even a floor. That's not a net. That's an open doorway. I think that with regards to confrontation, again, there are economic aspects that can be undertaken. The companies that are doing this reclamation should be given a fairly simple choice. You can work for China and make millions, or you can work the global market that the US, Europe, and Japan can influence, and that's billions of dollars. I think many of these companies may well at least impose pressure on their own system to rethink some of their policies. And then with regards to our allies, again, I think that many of them are still militarily less capable. They want to cooperate with the United States. We are representing the gold standard. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be engaging diplomatically. It doesn't mean we shouldn't be engaging in other aspects, but these are things that also do send a political signal as well, whether it is sales of more advanced weapons or whether it is cooperating in military, inviting our friends and allies to cooperate in multinational military exercises.
So that seems pretty proactive. I mean, not inviting the Chinese, maybe we continue to invite them, but we also invite our allies, is what you're saying. But I would say that there also should be an immediate prohibition of bringing the spy ship, if you want to call it that, right? That seems pretty axiomatic, as well as making the contractors make a choice, right? That seems pretty obvious as well. But those are kind of prospective, right? We could make that decision right now. But anticipating that China will always step one foot closer, what's in our arsenal of diplomatic, and maybe arsenal's not the right term, right? But what's in our grab bag of options to something that will be meaningful to China when it's either imposed upon them or taken away from them, et cetera?
Congressman, I think that, again, access to our markets is something that China wants as much as we want access to theirs. Financial markets in particular, we in an odd way represent sort of the underwriter's limited seal of approval when a Chinese IPO occurs. And the inability to access our stock markets, our financial networks, is something that should be undertaken very carefully, because that is a very, very serious step. But it does send a very serious message to Beijing. If you want to still benefit from that global transfer of funds that undergirds your economy, then you need to play by the rules that you have already signed up to play by.
Always a privilege, Mr. Cheng. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And now we'll go to Ms. Titus from Nevada.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Perhaps we shouldn't have been so anxious to send Bao Bao back if we are facing these kind of diplomatic problems. All of you have mentioned that we need to increase our engagement in the South China Sea, and all of you have mentioned we need to do this through diplomacy, not just with China, but with our other allies there. You pointed that out, Mr. Cheng. Dr. Ostlund said, I think your quote was, energetic diplomacy through ASEAN or attending some of these other summits. And then, Dr. Swain, you noted the only effective way to create a more stable environment in the maritime areas near China is for the U.S. to lead a serious diplomatic dialogue with Beijing and others in the area. You kind of trumped my question there in passing in your earlier answer, but I'd like to hear all of you say, how in the world are we going to be able to increase diplomacy, not just with China, but the other areas, when we have no clear message coming out of the White House. We have so many vacancies at top levels in the State Department, and we have what we anticipate a budget from this new president where they are just cutting as much as they can from the State Department. Are we not creating a power vacuum there? How are we going to deal with this situation? Maybe Dr. Swain, you could start.
Well, you're preaching to the choir on this. I mean, I think we don't know yet, right, exactly what the Trump administration intends to do by way of cutting back in order to pay for a $54 billion increase in defense spending. It's claiming that it's going to have offsets to be able to do this without having to raise taxes or increase the deficit. I don't know what that means.
We do know he wants other people to step up and do their share, so that's kind of a hint of what's coming.
So gutting agencies, EPA and the State Department, and to me it's just incredibly foolish if that's what's going to happen, because the State Department, more than any other agency, needs to have more funding. It has been operating on a shoestring for way too long, and to put them at a lesser level of spending is going to make the ability of the United States to really be effective in places like the Far East where it really counts much, much less. So I don't in any way sanction or endorse the kind of direction where the administration is going today. I think there has to be a clear strategic assessment about what our long-term future is in the Western Pacific and how we bring to bear our most important assets, diplomatic, military, economic, to achieve those gains. Much of U.S. policy has to do with process. Engagement is a process, as if it's something we can do or not do. We have no alternative to engaging with the Chinese. The Chinese are so big and so influential, and the rest of the world is so committed to dealing with them that efforts by us to try and cut back on that would be totally self-destructive. So we have to get smart about how we're going to be more engaged on this in a very changing dynamic for power relations, particularly in the Western Pacific. That's the only real area where the United States and China, in my view, can have serious problems. It's not over larger questions globally. It's primarily in the Western Pacific. And if we don't get that right, things are going to affect many, many other areas. So I agree that we need to have greater capabilities on the diplomatic side and on the economic side.
We've seen visiting some new democracies where China has moved in there very eagerly to build infrastructure. And if you start cutting back at the State Department, cutting back the small budget that is foreign aid, this can have repercussions beyond the South China Sea. Mr. Chin or Dr. Osland?
Congresswoman, just on your last point, I agree. We don't do infrastructure. We do capacity building. So if you want judges or police, you come to us. You want a road, you want a school, a power plant, you go to China or Japan. We should be doing infrastructure. We have spent decades, however, to get to your earlier point, we have spent decades stripping our capability of spreading a democratic message about our values and our society and our culture. USIA, U.S. Information Agency, was disestablished years ago and rolled into the State Department. The current cuts may be extreme, but they're part of a long trend under both Democratic and Republican administrations to make it harder for our diplomats to get our message out. We do need to turn that around. I believe in it, but it is only part of a solution. And as much as we need to engage with China, we have to be realistic. A country that wants to cooperate or be cooperative will do so without our blandishments. We have to understand the limitations of that even as we pursue it, because it sends a message to others who want to emulate our ways. Thank you.
I guess I'm out of time. I'm sorry. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll go to Ms. Gabbard from the great state of Hawaii.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here and sharing your insights and thoughts. No one's really talked about North Korea yet and how the various courses of action that are being suggested here will impact the very direct threat that we face from North Korea and the reality that any resolution to North Korea's situation will require the engagement and cooperation of China in that. So I'd love to just hear each of your thoughts on specifically how you suggest your suggested course of action will impact and the threat we face from North Korea. We start with Dr. Chang.
Representative, frankly, I don't see any solution to North Korea. Because the North Korean regime has associated itself with retaining its nuclear capability, and China has repeatedly demonstrated for pretty much the last 30 years it has no intention of solving the North Korean problem, particularly for the United States. And the reality is that North Korea's nuclear weapons aren't aimed at China. They are aimed at Japan, South Korea, and the United States, which from the Chinese perspective is not a great solution, but not necessarily a particularly troubling one. I will note, however, that the one time that anything was done that truly caught the North Korean regime's attention was when we shut down Banco Delta Asia by using the financial networks to force the Chinese, again, to make that choice. The millions of dollars that they gained from working with North Korea were the billions of dollars in financial flows that would otherwise occur. Unfortunately, after less than a year, we decided that those sanctions were too dangerous to continue and sustain against North Korea.
Thank you.
Congresswoman, thank you. I'd agree with my colleague. I would say, however, I'd modify it slightly to say that there are no good solutions to North Korea. There are lots of bad solutions to North Korea. And I agree entirely that we have to give up the fiction that China wants in any way to solve North Korea, certainly for our own purposes. I would say, however, that given the increasing erratic nature of the Kim Jong-un regime, the assassination of his half-brother, who was protected by China just a few weeks ago in Malaysia, as well as the assassination in 2014 or 13 of Chang Song-tek, who was Kim Jong-un's uncle, but more importantly, China's main agent in North Korea, means that Beijing is as worried about their influence as we are worried about our lack of. And there may be opportunities out of pure self-interest, which is a fine thing, for the two of us to figure out ways of pressuring that regime, or at least talking more creatively about how to contain it. At some point, by the way, we are going to have to decide when we declare it a nuclear power. It is a nuclear power. I understand that we do not want to shred the non-proliferation regime, but we're going to have to wake up to reality one day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I agree with what Dean and Misha have said already, that this is not a problem with a solution. I mean, it's really trying to maximize or optimize a bad situation. And unfortunately, what drives this situation the most is the behavior of North Korea, which no country outside of North Korea has real control over, including the Chinese. I believe that the Chinese have moved in their position towards a greater degree of cooperation and support in dealing with North Korea. They certainly wouldn't fully endorse everything that the United States might want to see toward North Korea for legitimate national security interests of their own, as well as other interests which may not be, as from our perspective, as legitimate. But I do think that we have choices here. We have the policy thus far has not worked. So we need to think about a new way of addressing this issue. We can't simply regard the Chinese as being the panacea, that they're going to solve it, because they're not going to solve it. So we have to think about how we can work with the Chinese, the South Koreans, and the Japanese to deal with it. We have two different paths that we can go. One of them is towards a greater degree of unified sanctions against North Korea in the hope that the regime will collapse or give up its nuclear weapons. I think that's very unlikely. I think they're committed to these weapons, and they're not likely to give them up. And they're going to continue to move towards a deliverable ICBM capability with a nuclear warhead. And when they get close to that capability, the question is, what do we do about that? And in my view, the only thing that one can do is you have to make a choice between being, well, you can combine both. You can be extremely clear about the consequences of any use or threat of use of a nuclear weapon by North Korea, that it involved the destruction of North Korea, and that this applies to threats to South Korea and to Japan, our allies, for whom we have a nuclear umbrella. And at the same time, however, I think we have to consider whether or not it's possible to develop a diplomatic strategy in which you address each of the concerns that the North Koreans have said that they have on their security front. Many people say this is all useless because the North Koreans will ignore all this and continue to take advantage of it. But you can make the argument that the United States and the other powers have not fully tried to implement what you call an omnibus approach to North Korea that would give them, over a period of time, in response to certain actions that they would take, a certain level of benefits for them, economic and diplomatic. And if they turn those things down and you offer them all in good faith and the Chinese sign on to that, then the basis for the Chinese to continue to not cooperate in dealing with North Korea will be reduced, in my view.
Thank you. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.
There are clearly no easy answers to the situation, but Dr. Swain, I would argue that the time to ask that question, what will we do, is now, and understand that as we look at these other issues, whether it be the South China Sea or other issues within the region, we can't operate in a silo with any of them because of the ripple effects that will occur as we look at the various threats that exist there. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. And they've called votes. We've got 10 and a half minutes, and I'm going to turn this over to Mr. Connolly from Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'd welcome our panelists. And if we can all be concise, I'd appreciate it because we're going to go vote. My concern is at the very start of a new administration, we have seen or we are seeing policies that contradict each other with respect to this region and China. So we rattle the cage with a call to the President of Taiwan. We announce a budget that's going to add $54 billion in defense spending, and the purpose of which is for shipbuilding, military aircraft, and establishing, quote, a more robust presence in key international waterways and checkpoints, unquote, like the South China Sea, while saying we're going to fund that by cutting back on the State Department and AID specifically. Now, I was just in Sri Lanka. The Chinese, as you said, Dr. Osland, are building everything in ports, airports, roads, bridges, high-rises, sports stadiums, hospitals. They're building it. But we're financing democratization. We're providing real in-depth assistance both through IRI and NDI to help, frankly, democratize institutions in Sri Lanka, and it's working. But that's funded through the aid program. Now, if we retrench in our foreign assistance and diplomatic posture in places like the Philippines, Vietnam, Burma, Sri Lanka, doesn't that create a vacuum for the Chinese? And before you answer, so that's one vacuum I'm worried about and one set of contradictions. The other is, in the first week, we rip up TPP. And what's happening as we speak? Beijing has summoned a region-wide convocation to talk about a new trade agreement that has zero provisions on labor, on human rights, and on the environment. And I don't know, I'm a simple soul, but that seems like we just contradicted ourselves and frankly handed an enormous victory to the Chinese that will be very long-lasting. Your comments.
Representative, I believe that TPP was negotiated by the previous administration that indicated that it was not going to bring it forward to Congress. It was not going to present it for a vote at all. And in counting noses over who would have voted, I'm not sure how many members of the previous administration's party could be relied upon to vote for TPP.
Irrelevant point, Mr. Cheng. I'm making a different point. And by the way, I happen to be one of those people who would have and did. However, what I'm making, and if you don't want to answer it, then I'll move to Dr. Osland and Dr. Swain. The question is, are we not handing an enormous victory, irrespective of what Obama's administration was prepared to do or not do? They were prepared to bring it to a vote, but time kind of ran out. But didn't we just hand the Chinese an enormous victory, and isn't the witness of that what's happening as we speak in Beijing? 30% of all of the world's economic activity is going to be covered by the agreement they're now forging. And I might add U.S. allies like Australia and New Zealand. Maybe Australia isn't an ally anymore after the tongue lashing they got from the new president. But Dr. Osland, did you want to comment?
Congressman, I would prefer to see the administration go back to TPP. However, if all we can get are bilaterals, and I think we should all push as strongly as possible to get bilaterals, starting with Japan. Your point about the aid vacuum, I think, is important. It is an important part of our strategy. I would prefer to see that part of the budget increased as well. But we have to do a lot better at the messaging that we send out. We have not been very good under either Democratic or Republican administrations in the State Department sending out those messages. Thank you.
Dr. Swang, real quickly, because we're running out of time.
No, I basically agree with that, but I think the United States does really have to have a much better job, do a much better job of presenting what the economic costs and benefits are and what the advantages the United States gets from multilateral trade agreements, but it's just not in the position of doing that.
I just have never seen the United States quite so blatantly in the matter of 1 month contradict itself so profoundly with respect to something so important, namely our relations with China. So on the one hand, we want to deter them, and we're going to build up military forces to do that, and then the other, we're going to unilaterally disarm on trade and foreign aid and diplomacy because we're going to defund it. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, gentlemen, for being here. And just kind of one last comment, because, again, what I hope to get out of this is to get enough information that we can help direct some of the foreign policies. And I read an article, and I got chastised for this because I brought it up in this committee. They were talking about how China, as you brought up, Dr. Oslin, how they go in and they build infrastructure, and we focus on other things. And I think it's a misstep of ours. We should go in and build strong infrastructures and develop strong trading partners. And in that process, we'll bring people to our side and meet the goals that we have as far as human rights and things like that. And I think we should focus on that. And then I want to point out to Dr. Swain, and I know you're well aware of this, Robert Gates' book, Duty, there was a section in there they were talking about military sales to Taiwan. And a couple years ago, the Chinese negotiator raised holy Cain because of the military sales, and our negotiator says, why are you making a big fuss over this? We've done this for many years, since '79. And he goes, yes, you did, but we were weak then, we are strong now. And I think we're seeing that presence. And so I think it's imperative that we come to an agreement of what we can do and can't do and forge those strong relationships. And I'm going to turn this over to the ranking member and let him finish, and we have to go vote.
Yep. China will become more nationalistic as it needs to satisfy its own population, and even more nationalistic if they face economic reversals. TPP enshrined the idea that currency manipulation isn't a problem, and its rules of origin provision gave China a chance to have free access to the U.S. market on goods that were to be purportedly only 50% made in China, but as an old accountant, I know that would be 80 or 90%, so 90% of the advantages of her free trade agreement, but at least they'd have a made in Vietnam label put on. We will not put tariffs on China because Wall Street won't let us. We will instead spend $50 billion extra on our military because the Pentagon will want that. And we will meet the domestic needs of the institutions that are most powerful in our society. Wall Street will be happy. The Pentagon will be happy. Beijing will fan nationalism. And Ohio and Western Pennsylvania will suffer. I yield back.
Thank you for your comments. Gentlemen, thank you for being here with your great information that you've helped us cipher through some things. And I look forward to dealing with you more. We have to go vote now. This meeting is adjourned, and thank you.